Hi everyone, my name is Camille Robcis. I teach in the history department at Cornell University, and I'm the moderator for these H France webinars right now, and I'm really thrilled to introduce my guests for today on a session on early modern capitalism in France. And I was saying before that I really think I'm quite a genius for having assembled these three papers because they work really well together, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to introduce our guests very, very briefly for two reasons. One, because we don't have much time, and I see that many of you are logging on, and I want to give you a chance to ask your questions. And two, because our three speakers today are really extremely accomplished, and if I have to read you all their awards, fellowships, and achievements, we'd be here all day. So I'm for more. So first we are going to hear from Francesca Trivellato, who is the Barton M. Biggs Professor of History at Yale University, and who is about to join the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton in the School of Historical Studies. She is the author of The Familiarity of Strangers, the Sephardic Diaspora, Livorno, and Cross-Cultural Trade in the Early Modern Period, published by Yale University Press in 2009. And today we are just very lucky to be discussing a chapter of her forthcoming book, which is titled The Promise and Peril of Credit, What a Forgotten Legend About Jews and Finance Tells Us About the Making of European Commercial Society. Francesca does not like short titles, I think, and that's to be published by Princeton in 2019. And the chapter that we're reading today is called Bordeaux, the Spectre of Crypto-Judaism and the Changing Status of Commerce in 17th Century France. Next is Charly Coleman, who is Assistant Professor of History at Columbia University. His Anti-Individualist History of the French Enlightenment, which was published by Stanford in 2014. And we are reading a piece of his forthcoming book, which explores the emergence and impact of competing economic theologies in 18th century France. I didn't know the title, Charly, but you can tell us later if you have one. And the title of this piece, which is actually an article that will appear in French Historical Studies next year, is The Spirit of Speculation, John Law, and Economic Theology in the Age of Lights. And finally, we have Michael Kwass, who is professor and the current chair of the History Department at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Kwass published his first book in 2000 with Cambridge University Press, and it was titled Privilege and the Politics of Taxation in 18th Century France, Liberté, Égalité, Fiscalité. And today we are discussing the introduction and the first chapter of his second and fantastic book, published by Harvard in 2014, Contraband, Louis Mondrin, and the Making of a Global Economy. So again, David already said this, but just so you know, I thought what we would do is structure the conversation. Basically, we would begin with short sort of presentations from each of the speakers, no more than 10 minutes, situating the piece and maybe kind of giving us the main arguments for if you haven't done all the reading, and also, situating the pieces within the broader works, but also highlighting the kind of historiographical interventions that they are making. And after all three have spoken, I will offer basically like some super short comments or kind of three themes that I see as running in between the three papers. And then we'll open it up to the virtual floor. So if you have any questions, if you want to ask a question, you can ask David to put you on camera, or if you prefer to remain anonymous, you can type in your question or comment and I will read it out loud. Does that sound okay to everyone? Okay, so Francesca, do you want to start?
Okay, so I presume I'm going first for reasons of chronology, because I thought that I would share with you the chapter of this forthcoming book that deals with the late 16th and 17th century, because much of the welcome rejuvenation of the scholarship on old regime French economic thought and economic life has focused on the 18th century for obvious reasons, because I'm going to turn off my email, otherwise it's going to keep constantly. Apologies. Obvious reasons being the French Revolution, and there's a fantastic new published and forthcoming work that will be too long to list. But there is very little, both in French and in English, on the 16th and the 17th century. So I hope that this chapter may prompt some questions about, basic questions about chronology, continuities, discontinuity, and that kind of thing. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this book, which covers quite a lot of ground, and connect that to what this chapter is about. So the book is about the growing abstraction of the paper economy in early modern Europe, which is best symbolized by bills of exchange, and the role that old and new, and a combination of old and new representations of Jews played in making sense of the fears generated by the expansion and abstraction of credit relations. So just a few words about bills of exchange that matters to understand why there's so much debate about it, even among non-specialists in the early modern period, such as lawyers, as in the case of the protagonist of this book. What you need to know about bills of exchange for the purpose of this conversation is that they are credit and currency conversion contracts that facilitate long-distance trade, but they allow merchants to deliver funds in a distant place in the local currency. But at the same time, they also, during the 16th century in particular, become instrument of speculation, particularly speculation on currency arbitrage and different exchange rates in different places. And so they also represent an increased divorce between the exchange of commodities and a realm of finance that is separated from that actual trade. Secondly, most banal but important point, bills of exchange are a paper instrument. They have no intrinsic value at all. They are not paper money, and that we may want to talk about it when we discuss John Law. There's not a lot of paper money in the early modern period. There's a lot more. So there is not a sovereign authority that backs the value of bills of exchange. Bills of exchange are in many ways the currency of the International Republic of Merchants. That is, the merchants, the signature on a bill of exchange is what is the guarantee for its monetary value. And thirdly, or fourthly perhaps, I guess in an H France it always has to be three, but I am long-winded as Camille said in my titles and in everything. So fourth point, bills of exchange are credit through bills of exchange is extended without collateral. So this is different from a pawn shop where you bring an item of value. The collateral in a bill of exchange is the reputation of the merchants who signs it. So the information, that is that what allows the circulation of bills of exchange is whatever informations merchants have about the solvency of other merchants. This is, however, a world in which information is very scarce, very valuable. You cannot run a credit score report. And so the outsiders, those who are outside this Republic of Merchants, as the lawyers who peer in this case, there's a constant fear that the kind of self-regulations that is underpinning the circulation of this commercial credit may give rise to oligopolies and cliques. And this is where the sets of analogies with Jews come in. So I'm not interested in sort of a all-encompassing notion that European history is always associating Jews and money, but really the argument I'm trying to draw is the nexus I'm trying to show is between a particular early modern image of Jews that lends itself to make them a metaphor for commercial credit, and that is an image that is crystallized in the late Middle Ages, particularly after the mass conversions in Spain in 1391, and then after the expulsions in 1490s from both Spain and Portugal, and that is the paradoxical notions of Jews as simultaneously invisible and clannish. And invisible because a lot of Jews, as in the case in the southwest of France, are actually baptized and therefore no longer Jews. And yet their baptism is never taken seriously enough or never trusted. So this chapter, is, that you have read or perused through, chapter 4, is the one that situates the text in which I locate this forgotten legend according to which medieval French Jews invented bills of exchange and marine insurance. Was written by a rather obscure, but at the time very widely read Bordeaux lawyers. And Bordeaux is the one area of Catholic Europe outside of Spain where the form of accommodations imposed by the Spanish Inquisition is also adopted, although the Gallican Church obviously never accepted the presence of either a Roman or Royal Inquisition. So between 1550 and 1723, Jews who fled Spain were allowed to settle in the southwest of France under the rubric of Portuguese merchants. And they were always suspected of being crypto-Jews, and there's a great number of inquisitorial trials about Jews who cross back and forth the Spanish-Franco border. So part of the scope of this chapter is trying to ask conjecturally why this legend emerged in this context in a non-deterministic way, but it's through a set of associations that are particularly poignant in this time and place. It also just gives a lot of information of what it meant to talk about maritime law in 17th century France, which is, a rather obscure topic, but something that was at this really sets of concerns of Richelieu and particularly the period before Colbert, the first 3/4 of the 17th century, which are very little known, and what were the forms of a royal intervention in the early attempts to expand both in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic. And the second important things the chapter tries to do is to think about this very important transition in early modern commercial law from a personal status law to a subject matter law. So in 1563, there's a royal ordinance that establishes the jurisdiction consulaire, which at the time are corporate tribunals, which merchants who are members of a guild of merchants try them, adjudicate their own disputes on most commercial matters except for bankruptcy. Over time, there's a growing expansion of what it means to be a merchant. And by 1673, by the Ordonnance de Commerce by Colbert, everybody who has signed a bill of exchange is subjected to the jurisdiction of a jurisdiction consulaire. But by then, a lot of noblemen are signing bills of exchange. So you have if you think about the great dichotomies that inform the history or the traditional narratives about European history, the transition from status to contract, this is what is happening, in fact, in the 17th century, where sort of Adam Smith notion that everybody becomes a merchant is underway through, in part because of a top-down initiative by the Crown that relaxes some of the anti-commercial legislation for the nobility, and in part because of the necessity of allowing foreign merchants to settle. So I'm also trying to show that, there's very important, and I should acknowledge that Amalia Kessler has done quite a lot of this work before me, and the kind of well-known debate about la noblesse commerçante of 1756 is actually the end point of a set of debate. And so here the last point is that there is this connection between the erosion of the boundaries between who's a nobleman and who's a merchant, which is analogous in some respect to the erosion of the boundaries between who's a Jew and who is Jewish. And
okay, great. Can you, is this working with technology? Yeah, I think we lost Michael. Thanks, Francesca. So I think next is Charly. Can you tell us a little bit also about this piece and sort of where it's situated?
Yes, sure. And thank you for the invitation, and to Michael and Francesca for sharing their work. So this contribution, as Camille mentioned, is what I hope is the penultimate draft of an article that will be published in French Historical Studies in the fullness of time next year, perhaps. And before turning to the paper itself, I want to situate it in the broader project. Am I coming through?
Yep.
Okay, all right. So I want to situate it in the broader project from which I've taken it. So I'm currently writing an intellectual and cultural history of economic theology in Enlightenment era France. The tentative title is Transmutations, Economic Theology and the Catholic Origins of Capitalism in the Age of Light. Economic theology has no fixed meaning in historical scholarship, so I thought I would say a word about how I define the expression and how it relates to the subject of the book. So I aim to argue for the visceral presence of economic theology during the period, and defined in two specific senses. First, as a belief in the economy, both material and spiritual, as a means of redemption and fulfillment. And second, an economy of belief, by which persons and objects were designated as sources of value. So the book Transmutations explores currents of economic theology through the intellectual tumult, confessional clashes, as well as consumer and political revolutions that rocked France during the 18th century. As a source base, the book considers first and foremost the economic writings of theologians themselves, a surprisingly rich literature, varied literature that remains neglected despite its prominence during the period. I try to show that committed clerics, as much as merchants or royal administrators, thought deeply and extensively about economic matters. Their reflections were steeped in theological precepts of managing the debt of sin and marshaling the infinite wealth of divine grace. The influence of sacramental theory demonstrates, or at least I hope demonstrates, that from its inception, the modern economy has cast far beyond rational action and disenchanted designs in ways that scholars of religion and capitalism and of the European Enlightenment and the French Revolution have yet to apprehend. So by engaging with economic theology, I hope to arrive at a fuller understanding of how the quintessential capitalist fantasy of unbridled consumption first coalesced in ruminations on the mystery of the Eucharist, the generative faculties of money, the legality of usury, the necessity of luxury, and the sacred character of ecclesiastical property. From this perspective, economic modernity depends as much on desire as it does on reason. I put it in my article on law, a sense of the miraculous did not wither away in the cold light of calculation. Rather, it emerged anew as a faith invested in the limitless, endlessly creative expansion of the economic domain. So my book makes a case in contrast to Weber's thesis regarding the Protestant ethic for the existence of the Catholic ethic that animated the spirit of capitalism. This imperative radiated during the Enlightenment from a French epicenter, privileging the marvelous over the mundane, consumption over production, pleasures of enjoyment over the rigors of delayed gratification. And so while the capitalist economic system could be said to contain both sets of impulses, the latter continues to dominate in narratives of its religious origins. And so it is this question that, historiographical question that I want to address. So I adopt the framework of economic theology to account for the various ways in which 18th century French thinkers theorized and mobilized spiritual as well as material wealth. And so rather than making assumptions about economy as a specialized domain during the period, I want to show how it encompassed a diverse range of activities aimed at administering objects of value, from the grace of penance and communion to stylized projections of royal power and painted portraits, as well as on minted coins. And I would suggest that these phenomena further qualify as theological by virtue of the decisive role played by clerics in their elaboration. And so these were ways in which sacramental theory came to inform financial transactions. So again, as an historical corpus, economic theology comprises the writings of theologians themselves on matters of wealth creation and distribution. And then as an interpretive framework, it attends to continuities in the representation of riches without presuming a definitive break between a religious past and its secular futures. My cardinal premise is that the theological was always already economic, and in ways that anticipate but also complicate classical political economy, or at least political economy in its classic formulations. So in this way, I hope to depart from supersessionist accounts of God's surrender to mammon, and to take up the conspicuously visible hand of theologians in economic affairs throughout the period, from managing the debt of sin to raising the sums regularly demanded from the church by the French crown. In the 18th century, adherents of the Catholic ethic, adopting the boundless productivity of the Eucharist as their exemplar, established a law of surplus with moral and material inflections. The overwhelming debt of human sinfulness was not only negated by Christ's death on the cross, but converted into the grounds for the proliferation of grace. Salvation called for the labor of the faithful, but nonetheless required divine generosity. All limits were believed to fall away in the presence of God. The host in particular was significant because it could be conjured at will and almost endlessly, and through collective effort, worshipped perpetually around the clock. Likewise, investors in new forms of paper wealth, most notably perhaps during the rise and fall of John Law's financial system, imbued banknotes and stock certificates with an analogous fecundity. The sublime substance of money enabled its own spontaneous, limitless generation, with economic actors looking consciously to sacramental wealth as the precedent for their hopes and desires. So this brings me to the subject of my article and the position it occupies in the book as a whole. Essentially, the piece begins by presenting in rather abridged form materials and arguments that I mobilize in the first two chapters of the book, one outlining Eucharistic theology and devotion in broad strokes in the wake of the Council of Trent, and the second delving into 17th century debates over the use and the abuse of the sacraments, especially controversies surrounding frequent communion, inaugurated by Alnot, but taken up by many others. So the body of the article that you have now corresponds to the book's third chapter. In brief, it traces the influence of sacramental theology on the reception of John Law's efforts to reform public finance and colonial trade during the Regency. As I show, allusions to the mysteries of transubstantiation and transmutation abounded in cultural productions of the period. And as these references make clear, when Law launched his campaign to establish a new regime of public credit, he inevitably confronted the existing beliefs of French subjects. And in their world, priestly alchemists explicitly cast their hermetic transmutations in Catholic terms. They likened the philosopher's stone to the consecrated host of the Eucharist. Cartesians like Tarasov, who's in some ways the star of the chapter, claimed orthodoxy for associations between the Eucharist and notions of boundlessness, and depicted the metamorphoses implied as representative of the omnipotence of God. Tarasov would go on to serve as a publicist for Law. He was also a heavy investor in the system. And in his role as publicist, he attempted to transpose doctrines of sacramental infinity that he had developed early in his career into an economic theology. And so I argue that a Eucharistic alchemical complex, as I call it, lent itself not only to describing the function of shares in Law's companies and the notes of his bank, but also to rendering intelligible the myriad effects of these instruments. So like the consecrated host and the philosopher's stone, paper's efficacy followed from its dual nature as both visible and transparent. That is, as a means of exchange that not only passively reflected, but also brought into being the very existence of wealth. The spiritual desideratum of jouissance underwrote participation in Law's system, which demanded that French subjects invest with abandon in the dream of infinite accumulation. So Law's reforms, of course, they collapsed rather spectacularly in 1720. But this wasn't the only means, this is by no means the only moment when economic theology came to the fore. So the following chapters in the book are devoted to specific preoccupations of economic theologians during the 18th century. So the fourth chapter addresses polemics surrounding usury, a topic, of course, that Francesca also treats in her forthcoming book. My approach involves situating speculations on the necessity of indebtedness and the fecundity of money within the sacramental framework of penance and absolution. Then the next chapter approaches the consumer revolution from the perspective of economic theology by following its specific manifestations in the French debate on luxury. And there I argue that a fundamental impulse that provoked and sustained the unprecedented 18th century market for goods, again, was this Catholic valorization of jouissance and the identification of the sacred with expenditure. A sixth final chapter turns to the contested status of ecclesiastical property. This was one of the most pressing matters confronting the church and state in the final years of the old regime and in the early years of the revolution. Clerics claimed that their goods had been bestowed on them by God for charitable purposes and thus did not fall under the full jurisdiction of the crown. The monarchy saw things differently, as you might imagine, and alternated between supporting traditional prerogatives of the First Estate while continually attempting to extract revenue through the don gratuit and other measures over the course of the century. So I think I'll stop there. And,
thanks, Charlie.
Look forward to Michael.
Michael, please.
I can't hear him.
Yeah, Michael, we can't hear you. Hang on.
No, not yet.
Let me see, 1 second.
I'm unmuted by host.
I think David has to do it. Yeah, you're good.
Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Well, great. Thanks, Camille, for organizing this, and thanks for David Smith for putting together the whole framework. He's working behind the scenes as we speak. Anyway, I'll be fairly brief so we can get to the discussion. But basically, I shared a couple chapters from my recent book called Contraband. The book really grew out of my dissatisfaction with current secondary literature on consumption in the 18th century. I think that reading that literature, I was kind of frustrated by its kind of rosy glow. It was fairly, maybe a little too optimistic for me. A lot of the literature on consumption is kind of fundamentally apolitical, and that bothered me as well. And for a while, it was narrowly metropolitan, strangely enough, because many of these goods were not necessarily fabricated in the metropole. So I was reading around, and I discovered the problem of smuggling. I knew a little bit about it, but not much. And I realized I could use smuggling to do a number of things. So I thought I'd just mention a few of those things and then lay out the argument of the book, and then we can go. First, I could use smuggling to link basically the colonial history, the global history, to the metropolitan history of France. And that is, there's a lot of recent work on colonial history, which is terrific. And I thought this was a way to link the internalist metropolitan history of France to these wider studies on global history. And that to me was really exciting. I was trained as a metropolitan historian, so I had to kind of reach out, and that was a fun part of the project. The other thing I use smuggling for is really to bring economic history or capitalism back into questions of political culture. You know, we all know the kind of swings in the pendulum from the Marxist revisionist debate to a kind of post-revisionist debate in which political culture really came to the fore. And I think that was a remarkably productive move. I was part of that move. But at the same time, I think some of us were a little concerned that things were slipping a little away from core questions of capitalism and material life. So bringing smuggling back in was one way to do that. I also wanted to use smuggling to play with scale a little bit, and that was really interesting to kind of move from a global level to a national, regional level, to a local level and back again, and kind of see what happens when I put those levels together. And then finally, I did want to make the book somewhat relevant to what's going on in the world today, I guess in a couple of ways. While I was researching and writing, I was reading the newspaper like everyone else, and there was a lot of concern about the war on drugs and mass incarceration. And I can't help but think that sort of informed my view of what I was looking at in the archives. Hopefully didn't distort what I was looking at in the archives, but I did want to kind of bring some contemporary issues back in. And also the role of states and the global economy as well, which is obviously of relevance today. So the argument is fairly simple. I suggest that between the age of Louis XIV and the French Revolution, the French monarchy intervened in global trade in such a way as to stimulate the growth of an underground economy. Now that underground economy was always there. Salt smuggling had been around for a long time, book smuggling, wine, beverage, wine smuggling, etc. But with the addition of tobacco and Indienne, the calico cloth or Indian cloth, the underground economy is globalized. So then I realized, okay, well that's the start of the argument. And then what I realized is there was a number of cascading effects from that basic fact of the expansion of the underground economy. So what are these effects? They're political, they're cultural, they're intellectual. The first one I'd say is that the underground economy, or the kind of reinvigorated global underground economy, fueled popular rebellion. So here I'm sort of working off the work of Jean-Nicolas, his brilliant work on political rebellion. But I add to that what kind of Mondrian's political theater, that is how Mondrian improvised a certain type of political theater in his smuggling in a way that politicized the contraband trade. One other cascading effect is that the violent underground economy encouraged royal officials to revamp the criminal justice system. So this really kind of surprised me, but the existence of this broad underground economy prompted a crackdown by royal authorities, and that's sort of where the present day resonance came through, obviously. But I was honestly surprised and really intrigued by what I found in the archive, the expansion of the foreign police, whole new levels of extraordinary justice that are brought to bear to repress the contraband trade. And this repression, this judicial and police repression, in turn, provoked a vigorous public debate. And this is where the intellectual and cultural history sort of comes in. So I could look at the popular culture surrounding Mondrian as a kind of legendary smuggler and a violent one, as well as Enlightenment debates about smuggling. And these were quite intriguing. I read a lot of the political economy of the Cornell circle, physiocrats, many other political economists who are kind of hard to characterize. Also legal reform, thinkers of legal reform like Beccaria and many others, to see basically how intellectuals of the period invented or produced new theoretical contexts through which to approach the problem of smuggling. And basically that really further politicizes the general debate about smuggling and made it a very interesting topic of concern for many writers of the period. And then finally, I tried to kind of show how all this funnels into the French Revolution. I'm not arguing that this is the main cause of the French Revolution, that smuggling was the main cause of the French Revolution, but certainly smuggling, repression, the debate that all this prompts in the wider public sphere are very much part of the moment in the late 1780s and early 1790s as the revolution begins and as it takes its course. And I tried to show kind of how that thread is woven through the revolution up into the empire. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to elaborate on any aspects of the book or the chapters you've read, but also I'm happy to talk more about capitalism in general, what early modern capitalism looks like, or the kind of theoretical underpinnings of recent moves towards histories of capitalism in Europe and in people studying the United States and other countries as well. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much to all three. So I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to open it up to the floor. I wanted to just say that, as I said at the beginning, there's a lot of overlapping. Oops, sorry. Let me turn off this too. No, there's a lot of overlapping themes in the three papers. So I'll just mention three that I saw, and then if you want to, we can pick it up or not. The first one is that everybody is interested in the question of circulation. Three papers revolve around the question of circulation, and there's a very interesting shift of scales in all three papers, sort of between the micro-historical and the global. So this is something I thought we could discuss. So, in the case of Michael, the kind of, there's these three historical forces: globalization, consumption, and state formation, and yet the story is told through this kind of the lens of Louis Marin, and you say as a way to kind of humanize these abstract arguments, and you're consciously playing with this question of scale. So again, I'd love to hear you, sort of the three of you, talk about this shifting of scale. In this case of Francesca, again, there's kind of these great geopolitical battles going on, right, from Richelieu's diplomatic wars and of course the background of the wars of religion, and yet the focus is on this one guy, right, Clerical, who somehow has this really important role in in introducing this particular version of capitalism, right? And then in the case of Charly, again, the story is focused on this one character, John Law, but there's all these kinds of macro global phenomena happening behind him, right? So that's the first kind of topic that I would love to hear you talk about, either in your story or in the other stories, or how you kind of have shifted from this question of microhistory to global history in your projects. The second is more actually for Francesca and for Charly, but this is an obvious topic there, is the question of religion, of course, in both papers. So, Francesca putting Jews, or not even, I'm curious if it's Jews or the fantasy of Jews at the center of the story. And then Charly, putting Catholicism at this idea of having a Catholic ethics of capitalism. So putting Catholicism at the center of this. So, I guess the question is, how important is religion to these stories, right? How important is Catholicism? How important is Judaism? And finally, what I thought was very interesting in all three papers was that you really link the economic to the social and the political. And this, I think, Michael, you make a plea to that you really want to integrate economic, political, and cultural histories. That this is an important, right, that this is an thinking of it as of the cultural. And you see in all three papers really well how these economic concerns are really destabilizing political and social structures of the old regime. So I would love to hear you sort of talk about those questions also. And so it's a slightly different period in all three papers, but it's still a period in which some of the certainties of the early modern world are crumbling, whether it be kind of in Francesca's story with the kind of the growth of the noblesse de robe and the kind of the decline of the guild system, and in Michael's story, again, I mean, all three, and certainly in Charlie's story, sorry, the struggles between the king and the parliament, and similarly, I think in Michael's story. So, and also the kind of, in Charlie's story, the background of the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, alchemy. So I would love to hear you sort of talk about this a little bit more, about what kind of economic history, how you're seeing economic history here as integral to these other fields. But I think you should answer these if you're interested as we go along, because I see a lot of hands already and questions. So I'm gonna start maybe asking David. Do we want to ask Arazu, who raised his or her hand? I'm not sure, to ask the first question, and then I got a question in writing too from Hannah that I will read right after.
Yeah, Arazu, if you can hit the start video button in the bottom left-hand corner. There we go.
Welcome, Arazu.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for all the interesting papers. This is my first H-Friends webinar, so I hope I'm right. I'm a French historian, so I'm curious about all of these papers, and I'm working on economic history myself. But I have a question for Francesca. You mentioned in your book you're reviewing a long period, which is between 1550 and 1723. You mentioned that you'll be talking about the. So my question is: are you focusing on the settlement of Jewish merchants in the southern France, or this is just for those Jews who are having trade relationship with the France and with France in the Mediterranean trade, and how the changing in legislation in terms of kind of expulsion of periodic expulsion of the Jewish community and affected the bill of exchange, like the acquisition of bill of exchange or retaining the bill of exchange among the Jewish merchants. I hope that was clear.
Camille, what are instructions? Are we answering each question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that makes sense, because otherwise, unless we want to take a several, but let's do it like this. And if we see a lot of questions at the end, then maybe we can group them. Does that sound good?
Sure. Maybe I'm going to give a longer answer to this question, and in so doing, trying to address your second question about religion, where I see, obviously, a great deal of overlap with some of what differently, but what Charlie Coleman is doing. So first of all, the book actually covers the period from the late Middle Ages to the 21st century. So this chapter, so the book is one of the goals is precisely to show the centrality of religion, particularly of Catholic theology and Christian view of Jews, in the conception of what the economy writ large was, both in the early modern period and during the crystallization of modern scholarship in the 19th and early 20th century. So first of all, this legend that Mr. Clerical probably committed to print for the first time, but we don't know whether he coined it or whether it circulated before. I point out it is published for the first time in a commentary on maritime law, which is the first indication of what I'm trying to say, that religion permeates the very early modern literature on overseas trade that tends to be seen as more and more secular within quotes. So this is, there are very virulent sort of anti-Jewish imagery that one would normally associate, with a Franciscan sermon or with an Elizabethan play. But in fact, they pop up in text written by a lawyer interested in actually validating the worthiness of good credit. Sorry, my lights went off. For those lawyers who are not trained with a lot of knowledge in commercial and maritime law, but increasingly find themselves adjudicating on a day-to-day basis disputes between merchants. In terms of chronology, and that is really directly, I think, addressing something that is very important for Charly Coleman's work as well, the really forgotten century of European economic thought is the 16th century, which is when Catholic theologians were the greatest economic thinkers in Europe. And there's a lot of continuity and transformations, particularly in the conception of usury and monopoly, that occurs in the 16th century, and that a lot of Catholic theologians, very mainstream and influential ones, devise new arguments to legitimize certain contracts and not others. Just for example, the notion that first marine insurance and then bills of exchange, certain bills of exchange are defined as purchase and sale contract as opposed to credit contract, and therefore are legitimate by canon law. This is done through exceedingly abstruse arguments, but without understanding what those arguments have come to do in the 16th century, we really don't understand what, sort of a lot of what somebody like Mr. Clerical, who has gone to the best humanistic schools and faculty of law in Bordeaux, acquires as a knowledge, is sort of a vulgarized, distilled version of all these debates. And so what I'm saying is that in defining this essential and yet constantly moving target of what is the line between proper, productive, legitimate credit that sustains the growth of the state and the well-being of the subjects of the state. A lot of the arguments about that where the moving target is are grounded on moral theology that comes out of the late Middle Ages and the 16th century. So yes, it is images of Jews that map onto different realities they live on through tradition, and they're then constantly, refashioned and mobilized and used to define reality in of itself. Mm-hmm. So the last expulsion, the Jews are expelled in France by the late 14th century. There are supposedly no Jews. Then during the several wars with the Holy Roman Empire, there's a different story about Metz, Alsace, and Lorraine. But other than in Avignon, which is a papal, separate sovereign area, there is this area of the south, it's very easy to cross the border between Spain and France along the beach. There are the Pyrenees, but you can walk along the beach. And there are a number of inland areas, as well as Bordeaux being the main center, where the monarch in 1550 explicitly issues this decree to welcome those who are known to be refugees from particularly after the creation of the Portuguese Inquisition in the 1530s, and calls them Portuguese merchants. Okay, so it is an institutionalization of the notion of crypto-Judaism that is really peculiar because it's outside of Spain. It only happens in this area of France. The other European states that decide during the middle and late 16th century to welcome Jews who are fleeing Iberia and Portugal, they go through a period of experimentation and then decide to welcome them only as Jews, and so allow them to revert to Judaism and even promise them in places like Venice or Livorno not to inquire on their previous baptism. Because for canon law, Baptists can never be rescinded. And so obviously there's a lot of debates about forced baptism, but by this point, if you have been baptized, and if your ancestor have been baptized, and if you've been baptized, you will always be a Catholic. You cannot just revert and just say, I no longer want to be a Catholic, because otherwise you become subjected to the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. And so what is peculiar about the southwest of France is this institutionalization of the most, the most igniting, the most complicated issue for Catholic theology, which is the question of so-called baptized Jews. There's a difference with baptized Muslims, but we shouldn't go into that right now. So there are no longer periodic expulsions. These are subjects of the French crown. They're not even, they're even not subjected to the droit d'aubaine. They can bequeath their property. They are naturalized subjects. They baptize their children. They go to church. They are buried in Catholic cemeteries, and yet you can imagine in these relatively small town, everybody knows who's who, and the kind of fears that these situations elicit. There's a lot of literature of the time, but also a lot of there are reports by a lot of des intendants who go into the countryside and try to sort of monitor these communities that are constantly described as being, nouveau catholique, and so the anxiety is about the impossibility of ascertaining with certainty who's Jewish and who's Catholic, and that maps onto the opacity of these credit instruments, which particularly to non-specialists produce seemingly exceedingly complicated financial operations in ways that are very difficult to decipher. And that is, so the analogy is not with real life Jews, but particularly with the invisibility and yet the constant presence of Jews.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Can you hear? Sorry, I can't hear. Can I go ahead? Yeah.
Let's see. Oh.
Yeah, I can hear you now. Okay, so my question is for Professor Coleman. First of all, thank you for sharing this excellent paper. As a Montesquieu scholar, I think it's quite helpful for giving his readers a more textured understanding of why he compares John Law to the Pope in the Persian Letters and associates his economic designs with alchemy. As for my question, at one point you mentioned in your paper that Tarasov wrote a number of articles in Mercure de France praising Law's system. Part of my research examines the Jansenist influence on Montesquieu during his intellectual formation, and I'm wondering whether you came across any Jansenist literature that responded to Tarasov or criticized Law's system during the early Regency period.
Yes.
Actually, Charly, can I add one more question to you since we're out here? There's another question for you that I thought we could tag along to this. That way you can maybe answer both. But this is from MMH, so it's 73. And it's actually about for you and Michael also. But he says, so could you ask Professor Coleman, Michael Kwass just mentioned his dissatisfaction with the metropolitan inclination of literature on consumption. I would like to ask whether the Mississippi bubble was mainly a metropolitan affair. Outside of Paris, were many people drawn in by Law's scheme and affected from the value of their India company stock, or public bonds evaporated? And there was another one I'm going to try to recover, but sort of I don't know how you could bridge these two if they have anything to do, but if you could somehow answer them, that would be great.
All right, so briefly, I mean, there were theological criticisms leveled against Law and his system across the doctrinal spectrum, so including Jansenist, but it wasn't a distinctly Jansenist position. So that's worth noting. I mean, I should think more carefully about the extent to which Montesquieu's own Jansenist influences informs the position he takes on law. But I'll need to think further about it. Tarasov himself doesn't seem to be deeply invested in the doctrinal controversies surrounding the orthodoxy of Jansenism per se. There are ways in which his Cartesianism maps onto certain currents within Jansenism in the second half of the 17th and the first half of the 18th century. But again, Cartesianism extends beyond Jansenism, and Jansenism extends beyond Cartesianism. There are points of intersection. There's yet a further, I would quickly add, this goes again beyond Jansenism, but yet another figure in the history of economic theology that is worth noting, and that is Turgot, who seems to have been exercised by Tarasov's letters in the Mercure, and also influenced by Montesquieu's publication of the Spirit of the Laws in 1748, and then writes a letter to the Abbé Cissé on paper money, in which he excoriates Tarasov, and by extension, law's whole system. And there's this curious quip he makes that if Tarasov's arguments for the system, if they logically hold, it would be as though we had discovered the philosopher's stone. So I should have included that in the paper, because I think it's an interesting point to end on. Quickly, the question about metropolitan history. Of course, the system extended far beyond Paris in its economic origins and economic effects. It drew on investors across Europe. Its financial, its economic base was considered to be the wealth of the entire kingdom, but particularly colonial holdings. So of course we have to consider that context. There's also, there's the economic dimension. There's also a certain cultural effervescence as well, given the almost magical qualities that are attributed to colonial riches in particular. And I think that aspect of the reason why such faith could be invested in the system, at least temporarily, is worth drawing out farther than I do. But I think, should I allow Michael also to weigh in here, perhaps?
Yeah, well, Hannah had another question.
Okay.
Also for, I think also for Charlie. Do you want to ask it, Hannah?
Here we are. So I was curious, near the end, you talked about law devaluing the paper money that you put out and the cataclysmic result. And I was wondering how the economic theologians responded to that, and whether they accused him of being prejudiced or unreasonable the way that they had accused his opponent. Thank you.
Were you able to hear that? Yeah.
I think I caught it in the main. So
I have it in writing, if not, in the middle paragraph of page 38, about the devaluation of lost paper and how these economic theologians responded to the cataclysm betrayal of trust. Just interesting against.
Right. Well, I think it depends on one's, the theologian's position on the law system in the first place. So if one thought that it were a complete charade in the first place, then the devaluation of the bills would seem to be a moment in which reality finally is restored. And so it wouldn't be terribly surprising. Now, I mean, Tarasov lost a great deal of at least virtual assets with the collapse of the system. He seemed to take it all rather well. Surprisingly, he was rather sanguine with the loss of his fortune and didn't seem particularly bitter. The other thing you see, and this actually, I mean, this takes place at the level of clerical institutions as well as your individuals is you see this attempt to essentially divest oneself of debt in the final weeks before the currency is devalued. So they're clerical institutions that will take advantage of the collapse of the system, as were many other secular institutions and private individuals.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks, Charlie. So I think actually David had a question for both Charlie and Michael. So maybe David, since you can take your prerogative as organizer of this.
Okay. And Francesca, this might also tie into you too, but one of the things I was struck with in some ways from Charlie's paper, but I know Michael's work on this also, I think will give him some reaction to it, is in talking about the theological economic thought, or however you want to phrase that. I guess what I'm wondering is, have you also looked at how the merchants are talking about this, how guilds are talking about these similar issues, and how their language is similar or different from the more abstracted theoretical type texts that tie into economic thought? I'm particularly struck here because I've recently been reading some Bois-Guilbert, who has a lot of Jansenist elements with him. But I've also been reading a lot of administrative debates over economic issues. And it strikes me the administrators are often talking about the same issue that Bois-Guilbert does, but they strip out all of Bois-Guilbert's religious theorizing over these issues. And in looking at merchants and at guilds, you can see some of the more theological elements, but not as much. So what I'm really wondering is, in this economic debate, what's the connection between what you're seeing and what might be a broader economic discourse over some of these issues?
Charlie, do you want to answer? I don't know who's going to take that up first. I think that was more directly to Charlie, but I'm happy to answer.
Sure.
I mean, obviously, Bois-Guilbert, he figures centrally. I mean, he's in the chapter version of the article I gave you, but space wouldn't allow me to include the discussion in the abridged version. So, I mean, yes, David, as you point out, Bois-Guilbert himself was a committed Jansenist. Intellectual historians of economic thought have charted the ways in which his Jansenism influenced his specific policy prescriptions, and there's a much broader literature on the role that Jansenism plays in the coalescence of political economy in France, especially in the second half of the 18th century. I suppose what I would say to that is, I mean, yes, that is one axis that has been fairly well represented, but I would like to expand these constellations of intersections so that to somewhat decenter, they're not entirely displace the role that Jansenism and Jansenists have played in the intellectual history, precisely because it seems to me that other currents within post-Tridentine Catholicism are far more deeply invested in a sense of divine largesse, the absolute abundance of grace and its charitable distribution, which itself, I would argue, has a certain economic valence. So I would answer your question. I would say yes, and then yes again, that we expand our perspective even further. I mean, the one thing I'll add is that I don't want to insist on too absolute a distinction between the views of quote unquote theologians and the views of merchants. I mean, this is where this gets at Camille's broader question about the question of the significance of religion. Given the mercantile and the financial predominance of the church at various scales, international, national, as well as local. And so yes, you can find intersections between those we would identify as merchants and those we would identify as theologians, but often those occupations are pursued by the same individuals.
Yeah, can I jump in on that? Yeah, Dave, I think that's an excellent question. I mean, excuse me, there's obviously a whole universe of economic ideas and language out there in this period in early modern France. I think much of the scholarship, just because of the traditions of intellectual history, have tended to focus on, fairly well-known people who have been deemed political economists kind of retrospectively. But obviously there's a world of practice beyond that, and there's a world of popular culture beyond that. So I think it's really interesting at this point to look at where the convergences and divergences are among these different groups. And I think that's really, in my mind, a kind of refreshing way to approach this question. In my own work, I did this, I tried to do this anyway by looking at language that we all know from political economy and compare it to, first of all, the language coming out of the world of practice, that is, what smugglers themselves are saying, what royal officials are saying about smugglers. These are sort of like the equivalent to your administrators looking, looking at Bois Guilbert's problems about all kinds of things, grain trade and other questions. And also popular culture. So, Bibliothèque Bleue pamphlets and biographies, all sorts of things. It's a messy world out there. It doesn't mean we can't try to impose order on it as we analyze it, but I think it's interesting to compare the language from these different places. And the languages that come from these different places are very different. I think we have to ask ourselves what kinds of language inform the culture as a whole. And all these languages do, and I think we need to pay attention to that. Just to give you an example from the smuggling problem. If you look at popular culture, there's kind of both the demonization of someone like Mondrian, a major legendary smuggler, and attempts to turn him into a hero in various types of very, very popular works. And there are books, there are popular works in between. And that's quite interesting. If you then move out to the world of practice, there, especially among smugglers themselves, but also royal officials, there's a language of royal authority, obviously, and popular justice. And you see that tension there between royal authority and popular justice that you wouldn't necessarily see in, say, the political economists. When you look at the political economists are quite inventive in this period. And by throwing in these other areas of discourse, I don't mean to marginalize the political economists. They're incredibly productive and creative. What I found is that they are adding a layer of theory to what's going on in the world of practice that has a very important impact on public debates. And sometimes that trickles down into the popular literature, and sometimes it doesn't. So, for example, the Gournay circle is emphasizing consumer sovereignty. Okay, that's not something that Mondrian and his gang members are going to talk about. They might worry about monopoly. That does come up in their language. But something like the idea of consumer sovereignty is a very abstract principle, that's something that's going to grow out of a learned culture and a kind of Enlightenment political economy. And the physiocrats, the same thing with the idea of natural order. Okay, that's something you're not going to see too prominently in popular culture, but or the world of practice, but you certainly see it among the physiocrats. And that sort of takes root. That becomes a fairly important, yet contested question about, whether the economy does conform to a set of natural laws. And if so, what are the implications of that? So I think your point is a good one, that we need to compare these discourses and their sources and put them in conversation with one another. I think that's a productive approach.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And I was wondering if we could continue a little bit on the question of historiographical sort of use of sources. There's two questions. One, I guess one that's more for Francesca, and then but it perhaps offers you a platform to answer my question about microhistory. So I'll read the one for Francesca, and then there's one for the group. So from Kevin, this is for Francesca. I read your article, "Is there a future for Italian microhistory in the age of global history?" and wondered if you can elaborate on this. You mentioned that this is possible. You mentioned this is possible if we follow the travels of a single individual. Do you also believe some of the more traditional rules about covering a relative short time period, a smaller array of sources, and a focus on a subaltern still applies to constitute such works as microhistory? So I think basically, even if we haven't read your other article, we can think about more broadly the kind of, use of a singular case to construct a single individual to construct a microhistory and the kind of relationship between that and the global. And then for the group, there is a question which is tied to this, I think, to my question about the social upheaval and political upheaval of the period. And this is from Erica Voss. And so it says, this is a question for everyone. The narrative of capitalism in early modern France has tended to be tied to the narrative of the French Revolution. To what extent do you think that the post-revisionist histories of early modern French capitalism are contributing to a history of capitalism as a global phenomenon, given that the new history of capitalism still tends to be based around American and British capitalism? I think that's a really important point. How, given that this new history of capitalism field is kind of booming right now, but it tends to be very much an Anglo-American narrative. How do you think that your own stories are challenging this these narratives? So I don't know, maybe Francesca, you want to start and say a few words, and then we'll do Charly and then Michael, or Michael and Charly, or something like that.
Okay, so I hope Michael won't take me wrong, but I've grown paradoxically a little frustrated, although I think in his book, it works very well with the focus on the individual. In that article, I was actually trying to say that microhistory needs not be the sort of biography of or early modern globetrotters, although following an individual and following an idea is very much what I do in this work. But this book is actually one in which the chapter I gave you is the only one in which there are some like
microhistories
people. And I have, I know it's a recipe for obscurity, but I did it a little bit on purpose to walk away from a, previous work that I had done. And here I actually follow the thread of ideas and through, intertextuality and how certain kind of classification, a canonical classification of economic thought in different periodization or in different schools is actually questioned when you use a kind of a thread that cut across all of them. So, mercantilism, Colbertism, followed by anti-commercial or classical republicanism by Montesquieu, and then the physiocrats and so forth. In fact, they all contend with the story of the Jews and bills of exchange in different ways. So that was if the legend is the micro, which one can think about it, then there is more a question of what is in this chapter, what is the relationship between an event as the emergence of an idea and a discursive and historical context as, predefined to some extent. So I think there's still a lot of potential for way of using microhistorical tools. I just think that microhistory needs not be a biography. About the question of the relationship between the history of capitalism and the French Revolution, I'll make two brief comments. I purposely used the word capitalism very, very, very sparingly in this book. and only when I talk about the mid to late 19th and early 20th century scholars who tried to argue or tried to define what modern capitalism was. And in so doing, they had different narrative about the relationship between the Middle Ages and the early modern period. So that is a chapter particularly about Marx, Zombart, and Weber, and the kind, what I call the medievalist revolts about the, because one thing all of these three thinkers have in common is that the 16th century is when modern capitalism is born, and the previous so-called commercial revolution is now capitalistic. So I purposely, in trying to question the facility with the new history of capitalism calls everything capitalism, which has been, helpful in some ways and very confusing in others. And also, I'm very sympathetic to certain aspects of the emphasis on the exploitative side of capitalism, which is at the root and at the center of the new history of capitalism. But as what the brief mention I made, and those who read the chapter, this question of the transition from a society of status to a society of contract also illuminates, profound transformation. That means that through that transformation, new groups, including women and widows and Jews, were brought into market transaction from which they had been excluded previously. So they were brought in complicated ways, but so I do think that the Anglo-American Atlantic emphasis of the history of capitalism needs to be questioned, and this is definitely a book that looks away from that perspective. But we also have to be very clear about what we want to, how we define and how we want to think about capitalism, rather than just applied as a general label. And if I can have just a quick word about the French Revolution, this is where my work is probably more pertinent. I have a chapter on the fact that the historians who study Jews see the French Revolution as the moment of emancipation. And the French historian of the French Revolution, and Michael might correct me, really did not think about Jewish emancipation as a central moment in the French Revolution. And yet, of all the discriminated against groups before the French Revolution, the Jews are those who actually gained the most in a rather chaotic way. It's not really part of a big plan, and they symbolize this transition from a society of status to a society of contract. Jewish men of property are those who gain equality, not women, not slaves, after the French Revolution. And so, interestingly, the Comte de Mirabeau, in the same year, in 1787, it writes the famous pamphlet, La dénonciation de l'agitage, that both Lynn Hunt and Robert Darnton have called attention to. But he also writes a book on Moses Mendelssohn and the reform of the status of Jews in the same time in the same year. And for him, there are two ways of talking about proper norms of credit and proper norms of behavior. And what this matters is because once Jews are emancipated, yet another form of invisibility emerges, because now Jewish men are citizens as every other man. And so how can you tell this? So what I argue is that emancipation is to the modern period what baptism is to the early modern period, because now Jews are invisible, and these new, sort of more racialized in the 19th century and harder, if you wish, boundaries, symbolic boundaries about who is Jewish emerge precisely, so there's also a way in which, the medieval and early modern views of the association between Jews and capitalism have some bear onto this momentous event, which is the French Revolution.
Could I jump in there?
Yes, please do, Michael.
Yeah, lots been said. On microhistory, I think that one thing it does, Camille mentioned that, it sort of humanizes larger scale historical forces. It illustrates them, and I think that's true. But one thing I think even more than that, where it's useful, is to see questions of agency and structure at work. So I think if you do it well, or a certain way, that is microhistory, I think it's easy to move beyond the individual to larger social structures, and that's where you can get to something on a global scale if you should choose, or a local or national, regional scale. But and I think that's quite useful. I'll leave it there for that. I mean, I'll say one more thing. I mean, in terms of the agency structure issue, this is where I think a lot of this attempt to integrate economic and political and cultural history comes from. These attempts by people like Bill Sewell, Jeff Ely, many others, to sort of bring the material world back in to questions of cultural history. Especially Sewell in Logics of History, he's talking about a kind of way of theorizing history that deals with the agent before a world of structures, and how agents, then historical actors, produce change by reading or deploying various ideas in the face of structures of inequality. So I think for that, I think microhistory is very, very useful. But yeah, there are limitations to it. No singular scale necessarily should dominate our own historical analysis. On this Anglo-American capitalism thing and the French Revolution, yeah, I mean, I think obviously capitalism has a traditional resonance in the English language, and a lot of British history and American history is based on it. So where does France fit in? Well, I think, first of all, I think there's been way too much caricaturing of the British Atlantic / French and French Atlantic worlds. That is, in many ways, I see these worlds as quite comparable. They're interactive. I think the idea of a kind of vibrant capitalist Britain versus a kind of retrograde, stagnant France, I think is ridiculous. If you kind of transcend these national boundaries, what you're really seeing is, I would say, a shift from Southern Europe to Northwestern Europe over the period of the 17th and 18th centuries, where there is, I think you can use the word, a kind of capitalism, we'll call it merchant capitalism, emerging, and that puts a lot of stress on the social order and on the political order of the day. I mean, I think, to get back to one of your questions, Camille, about these changes, yeah, the rise of a certain kind of economy, I think we're all talking about this. All three papers and a lot of other people are talking about what happens when you get a developing commercial order, call it merchant capital or merchant capitalism if you want. What happens when that grows within a traditionally bounded social and political order? Well, all kinds of things happen. And intellectuals try to recharacterize that order to kind of impose order on it. But it's clear that this raises all sorts of questions. And to me, this is the sort of stuff of the 17th and 18th century. Does that lead to the French Revolution? Well, obviously, these sorts of economic changes don't necessarily have to lead to revolution. The British case is a good example there. But I do think that in the French case, they do raise problems that are then worked on in certain ways, which can at least allow for a revolutionary opening if historical actors choose to enter it. So I think that's an important question, and the only way we can really get at that is through integrating economic and political and cultural history in some ways. So one last word on this notion of capitalism, whether we should use it. I don't think we should be afraid of it. As early modernists, I understand that, as an early modernist, I understand the hesitation. But I think if we are clear about what kind of capitalism we're talking about, I think that's much safer. So, the word gets thrown around a lot. But of course, there's an enormous difference between the industrial capitalism of the 19th and 20th century and something like the merchant capitalism, or some people call it small producer capitalism, of the early modern period. I think if we're going to use the word, we need to define it carefully within the period in which we work, and then go from there.
And certainly, I mean, when I was reading certainly Charly and Francesca, you do seem, I mean, Charly uses the term commodity fetishism, I think, but Francesca, it seems that you're also discussing something like that, the kind of, you know, the problem of abstracting value, basically. And I think, and you know, and obviously this is linked to the circulation that you're all interested in too. Charly, do you have any last thoughts on these questions of microhistory, French Revolution, or?
Very briefly, I mean, I appreciate the premise behind Erica's question and obviously agree with everything that Francesca and Michael have said. To be somewhat more specific, the historiography on the intersections between religion and capitalism is obviously vast. Weber, I think, looms, and certain Weberian narratives continue to loom. And there is a certain temptation toward Anglo-American exceptionalism in that literature. And so I think, again, we can work to show that the French history is not somehow aberrant, that it is also engaged even at the level of its theology and its ecclesiastical institutions in forms of economic modernization that perhaps do not look exactly like the forms they took in England and Britain. I mean, in particular, there is no Bank of France. Well, they attempted it, you know, and of course it comes crashing to the ground in 1720. But what they do have is the Gallican Church, which in many ways steps into the role that we would associate with the state bank. And so that is a somewhat distinctly French story, a Catholic story, but it isn't necessarily, I mean, I think capitalism is expansive, but we can also be specific about the particular manifestations or iterations of the system, which don't necessarily all exist in the same time and in the same place. It's far more fluid.
Thank you so much. So I think we are actually just about to run out of time. So I wanted to, there was one more question, I think, but I think I'll leave that for maybe a private question. But thank you. I wanted to just thank everybody who logged in and thank David for organizing all this, and really thank the 3 participants. This was a great conversation. I wish we had more time to continue it because I think that we're getting to some juicy stuff. And yeah, thank you again. You know, again, just and look forward to reading the 2 books that are coming out, and to everybody else, I recommend again this book, which is great. So thanks everyone, and I will see you for the next H France seminar.